Hello everyone, welcome to today's video. If you're new, go ahead and smash that like button, click subscribe. Today's video is going to be talking about the Stamp Act. So previously in class, we have talked about the Stamp Act, that act by the British government against American colonists, where documents are going to be taxed. We are going to be unpacking some primary sources from the time period. We're going to look at 3 different sources. We are going to answer this question here together. Why were the colonists upset at the Stamp Act? And how we're going to answer this is we're going to read through 3 different documents. So you should have a paper copy in front of you. What you will need a highlighter and you will need a pencil to make notes in the margins here. So I'm going to model through here document A. We are going to do B together. And then document C, you're going to read and annotate on your own. So let's go ahead and take a look here. And I'm going to talk through some different aspects here. So the first thing we're going to start by doing here is document A. It says BW's public letter, and it says modified. So BW, I'm going to assume here there's some initials. It's not someone's full name, but we can assume that it's somebody maybe with a nickname. So the information that the document gives me is this is a public letter that appeared on the front page of the Boston Gazette. Oh, I found that interesting. The Boston Gazette, I'm going to highlight that. We're going to come back to that. And the Country Journal, a colonial newspaper. It appeared on October 7th, 1765, and the author's name was printed as BW. So I want to look here, a couple of things to unpack. First is this right here, the 1765 date, and that's before that act went into place, before the tax actually took place. So I think that could maybe provide some interesting information. And again, anything I'm writing in here, I'm going to have you write as well. Something else here that I'm noticing here, I'm noticing the 2 things that I've highlighted. I see 2 newspapers. So generally, I would say newspapers are what we consider reliable, meaning they are going to publish information that is factually true or maybe has been vetted or has been analyzed by the newspaper itself. So typically newspapers we can see as a reliable source. Not always, but typically. I think what's really interesting here to think about the Stamp Act and what we've learned here, I think newspapers, while yes, they're reliable, however, if we think about the Stamp Act itself, the Stamp Act is going to be taxing documents. And well, if you think about newspapers are all paper. So many of the taxes that are going to be impacted are directly impacting newspapers. So you can assume maybe an American newspaper would be very upset by this tax act. I think it's just something kind of to keep in mind here. We haven't yet got into this, but Boston's going to play an important role here in the American Revolution. It's going to be the center for a lot of activity. We're going to talk more about that activity in the next couple days and weeks. But I think also knowing that Boston's a central figure here kind of helps maybe understand the letter we're about to read. Coming back to the author, we have BW, and I put nickname, but who is this? We're not quite sure. We'll see if the document answers that for us. But the information we have is just a public letter. So I would assume that BW, all we know about this person is that they wrote in to the newspaper, and the newspaper is now going to publish their letter. Let's go ahead here. And I think overall, we kind of come to the conclusion that I think overall this is reliable, meaning that we can trust that this is a real source and a real information from the time period, a real primary source. Let's go ahead here and start to unpack maybe what's kind of happening here. I think looking at the actual date before the tax started and contextualizing things. We know at the time period people were going to be very upset in the American colonies about the Stamp Act, but we can see what's happening here, that people are probably at the height of maybe feeling really upset about it. I see here in the document, and we are going to read and see if we can find his opinion, BW's opinion here, his or her, we don't know who, and see their opinion. So here's what the letter says. To the inhabitants or residents of the province of Massachusetts Bay, my dear countrymen, it is standing maximum, which that's just truth, so truth, So it is standing truth of English liberty that no man shall be taxed but with his own consent. And you very well know we were not in any sober sense, sober means serious, represented in Parliament when this tax was imposed. Okay, so this first paragraph here, that no man shall be taxed without his own consent. So it looks like this is kind of coming back to the idea again and again that the colonists are upset about not being represented when this tax was first passed. So the colonists, while they're upset at the actual act of the Stamp Act, but they're more upset the fact that this was passed and they had no say in it. So they're upset with lack of representation. Okay, we hear that sentiment again and again from the colonists. But let's go ahead and keep reading what BW says. Awake, awake, my countrymen, and defeat those who want to enslave us. Do not be cowards. You were born in Britain, the land of light, and you were raised in America, the land of liberty. Land of liberty. Oh, I think that this BW person, they're really proud to be an American. They're really proud. They're proud of the colonies. I'm kind of sensing that. I think that's really important. So it is your duty to fight this tax. Oh, okay. There's our first kind of key giveaway on BW's opinion here. Future generations will bless your efforts and honor the memory of the saviors of their country. Wow. Okay. So I urge you to tell your representatives that you do not support this terrible and burdensome law. Let them know what you think. They should act as the guardians of liberty of their country. This is particularly interesting to me because coming back to the first paragraph, the colonists were upset with the lack of representation, but now we have BW, the author of this letter, telling readers of the letter to contact representatives. That's almost, it goes against. So I'm a little bit stumped here. Are there representatives? Are there not? Based on this letter, it sounds like they might have them. I think we're unclear. Because if there are representatives, sorry, it's cut off a little bit, well, maybe that changes the fact the colonists should or should not be upset. So, I look forward to congratulating you on delivering us from the enemies of our truth and liberty. I think overall then, enemies, calling the enemies. Who is BW calling enemies? The British. The British. He's calling, or she is calling them enemies. So we can kind of overall gather that BW is upset with the lack of representation for the colonists, is proud to be an American, saying it's our duty to fight and future generations will bless the efforts, and then contacting representatives. That to me is very interesting. It almost goes against everything that we have learned. We're going to go ahead and take a look down here and talk through because I want you to get thinking about these different aspects. But let's go and look down here. Starting here, source A. So who wrote this and what is his job or her job? So I went ahead and told you the initials BW at the top leads me to believe that this is not someone's full name. The article was published in 1765 in a newspaper in Boston, so I would believe that this person is well informed. I'm taking kind of an assumption here that the newspaper is not just going to publish maybe not just something random, but they're going to look at maybe multiple letters and publish something that they believe is well informed or well written. So we don't know their job and we don't really know who wrote this, but and that's okay here, but I think it's important for us to kind of stop and pause here. Okay, next. Does he or she side with England or with the colonists? How do you know? I think clearly from what we look, BW is strongly against the Stamp Act. He or she calls this act terrible and burdensome. He even called Britain enemies. this is definitely someone who is pro-colonist, pro being against this act. And again, coming back to, yeah, they're upset with the Stamp Act, but they're upset with the lack of representation and government in this decision. All right, the next thing I want you to think about, contextualization. We're talking about what's going on. So based on his or her account, what's going on in America at this time? How has the Stamp Act affected them personally? Provide evidence from the document to support your answer. So just in general, keep it broad here. The Stamp Act has recently passed and many people are affected by it. The tax hasn't started, but the Stamp Act's getting ready to. BW doesn't mention how they are personally affected by the Stamp Act, but encourages those to stand for future generations, to take a stand. It doesn't say necessarily what that is other than contact your representative, but it kind of leads it up for us to decide. And then just overall, I'm going to ask two things, but do you believe this account? Give one reason why you would trust his or her account, one reason why you might not trust his or her account. So one reason to believe, I think, BW, is that he or she calls the colonists to contact their representatives, and that seems like a logical thing to do. I think that's like a logical step. It doesn't seem to be anything too drastic. It doesn't seem to see something over the top. That seems like a reasonable thing to do. It's a process that even today in our government, if you were upset, contact a representative who makes those decisions on our behalf. One reason to not trust this account is BW doesn't use his or her full name and the perspective is from the colonists only. So BW does not mention the perspective of Britain. We've talked about this again and again, I think with the idea that the taxes were originally implemented by the British so that the Americans could help pay for the French and Indian War that the Britons felt like they helped defend America for. And so we're coming with a one-sided perspective here that BW and other American colonists feel that this tax is unfair in the fact that they could not have a say in it. So I think, though, overall, coming back to my original, overall, I do believe BW because, coming back to that original point, it's published in a newspaper. The newspaper, maybe we can assume, to take the job of looking and vetting and looking at different resources. So we're going to repeat that again. We're going to mark up source B, and then we're going to answer source B together. Let's go and look at source B. Source B, it's from a London newspaper. So here we are again, newspaper. And it's from London. It's from London. So maybe from the get-go, we can assume that this person here, that the London newspaper might be from the side of a British perspective. But let's go ahead and read here. Will Alfred, so we have actually a name here. We have a full name. Will Alfred wrote this public letter to Secretary Henry Seymour Conway. Conway was one of Britain's two British secretaries of state, was responsible for relations with the American colonies. Wow. Okay, so Will Alfred, this random person who wrote it, is contacting a representative from Britain who is actually responsible for dealing with the American colonies. So this letter was first published in a London newspaper and then published in Boston Gazette Supplement on January 27th, 1766, nearly 3 months after the Stamp Act went into effect. So what I'm finding here is I'm seeing a perspective that's happening after. It's happening after. It's published, though, if you notice, not only in London, but it's also published in Boston. So published in two newspapers. That's going to maybe add to the legitimacy of this letter. So let's read this letter from Will Alfred to Secretary Conway and see what he says here. Okay. The riotous behavior of the people of Boston is remarkable. I would have been less surprised by their behavior if we had taxed their beer, because everyone drinks beer. But the Stamp Act is a tax on none of the necessities of life. It does not affect the poor, and even a poor person can afford this little amount of money. The tax on newspapers only affects the rich. Common people do not purchase newspapers. Isn't it surprising, then, that the mob of Boston has begun to riot against this tax even before it has officially gone into effect? I was expressing my wonder at this. when I was informed, but it was not the burden of the tax to be raised, but the manner in which it was imposed. This right here is where I want to stop and pause. That created the discontent. If this is so, the matter is more serious than may first appear. Okay, a lot going on here. Originally, my thought when first reading this was this person, Will Alfred, was going to be pro-Britain. But Will expresses the fact is he doesn't understand the outrage of the actual act. It's like he questions why people would be so upset. But it's more of the fact that Will is understanding that the colonists are upset that they had no say in the decision. So, but Will understands how upset people are with no say in government. So it's less about, in his opinion, it's less about the actual act and more about the fact that Will agrees and says, wait a second. He can understand the outrage from the Americans if this was passed and they had no say in it. So let's keep reading what Will says. The colonists are our brethren and fellow subjects. So agreeing that Will agrees that the colonists views them very much as equal Britons as to him himself. We should ask, therefore, whether they have behaved to them as brethren. The first birthright of a privilege of a Briton is that he cannot be legally tried but by his peers. So he's talking about if you're British, you should be able to be tried by your peers. That's the first thing. But one of the next, that he or any Briton cannot be taxed but by Parliament in which he is represented. Oh, so he cannot be taxed without Parliament in which he is represented. But the question is, do those who impose taxes on the colonists pay themselves a share of these taxes? If this is not the case, what have the colonists done that they are to be stripped of one of the most valuable privilege of Britons? Have the Parliament of Great Britain a right to take from any the lowest subjects the smallest privilege, which he inherits by birthright, unless forfeited by law? Wow. So Will is saying, in this case, that colonists have the right to be represented. It's a right to every Briton. Will here agrees that they should have that right and it should not be taken from them. So looking at overall source B, document B here from Will Alfred, knowing that it's a British writer that published in London but is going to be republished in the American colonies, looks like you would at first guess be, oh, this is someone who supports Britain and the taxes, but it looks like that this Will person is agreeing with the colonists that they are upset, not because of the actual Stamp Act, but coming back to this. They had no say in government. They have a right as British fellow subjects to have a say in taxation. So let's go ahead and we're going to do this source B somewhat together and fill in the blank here. So go ahead and look down here. Okay, so source B, we know who wrote this. Well, we know Will Alfred wrote this, but we don't have information on Will's job. Alfred did write to Conway, who was a British official. So we can assume that he is British since that it was published in that London newspaper, but then it gets republished in a Boston newspaper, which is, again, kind of really interesting. That why would the American colonies republish this? Well, maybe they're showing that, hey, there are people, they're showing the American colonists, hey, there are people in Britain who agree with us that we have this right to be upset, that we are being taxed without consent. Okay, so does he or she side with the colonists? How do you know? Alfred sides actually with the colonists. He makes the argument that only the rich have been impacted by this act, but it's more about the fact that the colonists have not had a say in this tax on stamps. Coming back to the phrase again and again, no taxation without representation. Okay, contextualization. Based on this account, what's going on in America at the time? How has the Stamp Act affected them personally? Provide evidence from the document to support your answer. The Stamp Act has passed and people in Boston are rioting in the streets. Alfred hasn't been impacted, but believes in the right that colonists should have a say in government. And so do we believe this account? Give one reason why we trust this account, one reason you might not trust his account. So one reason to believe Alfred is that he appears to be, I would say, informed about issues in the colonies. He talks about protests in Boston. He talks about the people being upset. He talks about, well, if they didn't have taxation without representation, they should be this upset. One reason, it's really not Alfred's fault, but we don't have much information who he is or his job. So both of them, we don't really know who Alfred is at the end of the day. And so that's a reason to maybe like, yeah, it's in the newspaper, so I probably can still trust it. Because overall, I believe Alfred and his letter was published in 2 newspapers, coming back similar to BW. It's in a newspaper, so for that alone, we might be able to trust it. Okay, so what's going to happen here is you are going to read and mark up the text like I did for document C. It's a Stamp Act collector's letter. You are going to, after you read and mark it up, don't forget to use the vocabulary. Presbyterians, a religion that gained popularity during the Great Awakening. Inflammatory is causing angry or violent feelings. Ferment means agitation or excitement, typically leading to violence. And allegiance would be loyalty. So use those if you get stuck here. But after you read that, you are going to write in here in a complete sentence, you're going to answer these 4 questions for source C. You're going to attempt that here on your own. And then, after you've looked at all 3 sources, you are going to write your response. Why were the colonists upset by the Stamp Act? Why was the Stamp Act an unreasonable, unfair tax? Why or why not? Were the British violating the Constitution? Were the British violating the colonists' rights? How are the colonists behaving in response to the Stamp Act? And then some historians have argued the American Revolution happened because a few rich leaders riled up all the poor people. Do these documents provide evidence for the argument? Is that evidence believable? You are going to write your response. When you are finished, I want you to take a picture of each of these 5 pages and you are going to submit this to Canvas. So again, you are going to read document C and answer 4 questions like we did together for document C, and then you are going to respond to the 5 questions. So you got this. Let me know if you have any questions. Look forward to seeing all of you back shortly.